the past few weeks, I've become profoundly disappointed with the state of white-dominated spaces on the online left. To my discredit, I still had some degree of hope for some people. I didn't expect the simple point of listen to the colonised about their own oppression to generate such a mass boiling of piss on the online left, and yet here is the piss, and see how it's boiled. What these last few weeks have really underlined for me is just how profoundly correct tweets like this from No Name are, and how profoundly committed to white supremacy figures on the online left like Vosh truly are.
Wokely segregating my socialist movement wokely.
We're going to come back to this tweet later on and unpack the various different levels to it, but for now let me sum up the issues that have been sparked recently and how I'm going to use them to discuss decolonisation, whiteness and the white supremacy that permeates the left. Here at JTD we like to reach into the gaping maw of discourse and try and rip something generative from its abysmal reach. So this latest round of shite was really kicked off when everyone's favourite dipshit Vosh, when he debated a black creator, Professor Flowers, during which he spent a great deal of time conflating decolonisation with ethnic cleansing and trying to call her a Nazi. Truly, we are entering the House of Reason.
But I've talked to white nationalists, and they kind of talk exactly like how you talk.
In online circles, this sparked a round of what can only reasonably be described as white people collectively shitting their pants. But what's important here is that this isn't something which is just confined to the online left and all their weirdness. Our weirdness, oh god, I'm one of them. But this exists offline as well. It's endemic throughout the entirety of the white left, particularly in the global north. So today we're going to start talking about why framing decolonisation as genocidal is just straight up wrong, why violent resistance to the coloniser is justified, and what the demands of the colonised are, before talking about how whiteness as an oppressive social object is created through colonisation and slavery, and finally how so many of the left are still so committed to white supremacy. The point of this isn't to add more drama to the ever-mounting pile of beef.
Beef me!
I will be making fun of dipshits when I can, because like Marx, I too am a messy bitch who loves drama. But really, I want to try and urge people who exist within white left spaces to really try and reckon with the ways in which we are still enamoured with white supremacy. So often do we hear ritualistic calls to raise up black and indigenous voices, which are true and we should listen to them. But I often feel that this leads a lot of white people to lapse into laziness, to not talk about or not confront the white supremacy that exists within our own spaces. This is what I want to challenge here, because it's not up to racialised people to constantly have to explain their oppression and justify their positions. Like No Name's saying, it's up to white people too. So we're starting off the discussions of genocide early for a JTD video. Am I the genocide and neoliberalism guy? Is that my brand? Can that be a brand? We'll get to the beef later. Beef, but for now it's genocide. Since the charge being levelled at colonised people is that classic settler fear of retribution, that the colonised want to genocide white people, I'll first explain here why decolonisation isn't genocidal, but is inherently resistance to genocide. I mean, I could here just say different things are different and leave it there, because this is a ludicrous case to have to make, but I will make it nonetheless. Firstly, I think it's important to point out that despite its dulling through its institutionalisation in international legal codes, genocide, as it was first conceived of by Raphael Lemkin, had an inherently colonial character. Lemkin described the genocidal process as the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group and the imposition of the national pattern of the colonial oppressors. This doesn't just mean like your classic mass killings, mass deaths as genocide. That was a weird way to describe it. But it means the destruction of people through cultural destruction and assimilation too. In fact, for Lemkin, physical and cultural genocide aren't two distinct phenomena, but different expressions of one underlying process. And he expressed deep regret when he couldn't get cultural genocide into the Genocide Convention because of blocking by colonial powers. You know, fucking Churchill. But what's really important here, and quite interesting actually, is how Lemkin's view of genocide bears a really striking similarity to Patrick Wolf's influential conceptualization of settler colonialism as having
both negative and positive dimensions. Negatively, it strives for the dissolution of native societies. Positively, it erects a new colonial society on the expropriated land base. As I put it, settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. In its positive aspect, elimination is an organizing principle of settler-colonial society rather than a one-off and superseded occurrence.
The dissolution of indigenous ways of life is a constant process of settler colonialism, whether that's through physical destruction or the expropriation of land, and the assimilation into the settler state, whether that's through the brutal residential school system in Canada, the kidnap and assimilation of indigenous children in Australia, or through land expropriation and forcing indigenous people into capitalist social relations. One really clear way that we can see this is through the constant dispossession and privatisation of indigenous land for the purposes of development and extracting profit. Worth noting as well that this extractivist development is deeply entwined with global warming. Look at the way that indigenous lands are expropriated in the Amazon for the purposes of clearing forests, or in North America for oil extraction. It's all tied together. Since many, not all, but many indigenous groups see the land as part of their way of life, the expropriation and destruction of that land for profit is simultaneously a destruction of indigenous cultures and ways of life, and also frequently involves carceral violence and the murder of indigenous people too. Another bright video from me.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
This is a process inherent to settler colonialism. As one indigenous activist, Alf Priestley, put it,
Aboriginal people are the land. We are connected to the land, trees, rocks and waters. Aboriginal people have been forced to sit on the fence about this. Either way, our land is being taken away from us. There is only 17% of vegetation left in Australia, and that's because these farmers and cities have cleared the land to put crops in and to build big towers.
The land is always stolen land in a settler colony, taken and pushed into ownership models. Worth noting here as well that collective ownership is still a form of ownership, right? It still subscribes to this white settler epistemology, which we'll get to later, which separates the people from the land and is inherently contrary to indigenous ways of life. See my video on debate culture for a discussion of this Cartesian epistemology, which is central to this discussion. One shameless plug. So far, the only way to halt this genocide is to return stolen land, break down all notions of ownership over that land, and support the colonised unconditionally for their struggle for true self-determination. A struggle which is necessarily anti-capitalist. Such self-determination just can't be won through assimilations into the settler state. As Coulthard argues in Red Skin, White Masks, the structures of recognition in settler states like Canada serve only to force indigenous people into capitalist modes of being, into settler-colonial modes of being, and thus maintain access to the land for the purposes of extractivist capitalist development. They do this by both distancing themselves from a previous settler colonialism, A bad settler colonialism, not like the good settler colonialism that fluffy Canada has now.
What is that? So 300 years ago, their dad showed up and they were born 18 generations later, and that means they're a colonizer?
And they're still...
And by framing and subordinating indigenous self-determination to the edicts of the settler state. Indigenous nations aren't viewed as self-determining nations, but as subordinate parts of the settler-colonial state. As Harry Nelson argued with a statement signed by 236 Indigenous residents of Australia,
these assimilation policies destroy our culture and our lives. It is the stolen generation all over again. The government is refusing to build us any housing unless we sign over control of our land for 40 years or more. We say no leases. We will not sign. The government having this control is no good. Our lives depend on our land. It is connected to our songlines, our culture, and our dreaming.
So, to briefly summarise all that I've just thrown at you, genocide, as it was originally conceived of by Raphael Lemkin, is inherently colonial in character. And on top of this, Patrick Wolf's conceptualisation of settler colonialism has clear continuity, striking similarity. I'm still quite surprised by how similar those things are with Raphael Lemkin's idea of genocide. And taking these two together, we can see how the continued process of separating Indigenous people from the land, dispossessing them of their land, is inherently genocidal. It destroys Indigenous cultures and ways of being while implementing white, settler, capitalist social relations, while also continuing to physically destroy, kill Indigenous peoples. It is then not only deeply, deeply fucking gross for figures like Vosh and others on the online left to draw equivalencies between land back and ethnic cleansing, and decolonisation and ethno-states, but it is entirely intellectually bereft. Different things are different. 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 You even see dipshits labelling land back as privatisation, which is just a wild thing to say.
Land back is privatisation of public land. I don't understand what's vague about that. Oh, hang on, wait. I'll make it sound like Peter Coffin.
We do not live in communism, and neither do indigenous people. This is simply creating a new place for the fundamental contradiction to occur. But you can't see this is questionable.
That's what they sound like, right? American.
And if there's one thing folk like this hate, it's being called a dipshit. Their entire fucking thing rests on people thinking that they're smart, they're authorities on things they don't know anything about. I'm gonna be very, very petty for a second, just to raise the mood a little bit. We've talked about genocide too long.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
But the way Vosh constantly talks about being a sociology major, or how other people would get thrown out of sociology departments for their ideas, is just... it's so lame. It's like, that's so lame, man. What's that about? What? I don't get why would you say that?
Your sociological analysis would get you laughed out of any undergraduate degree, and I can say that with the absolute confidence of a person who didn't get laughed out of my classes.
Listen, why don't you think of me more as a peer?
Like, I could make an intellectualized argument about how, you know, maybe it reveals a deep commitment to the legitimacy of Eurocentric models of epistemology and of knowledge creation like the university, and which would explain his inherent opposition to, you know, indigenous ways of being. But I also just want to call him a dork and stuff him in a locker. Anyway, decolonisation is not genocidal. It is the means by which we finally put a stop to 500 years of colonial genocide. And as such, it doesn't require our moralising or our hand-wringing. It requires our solidarity. even if it makes us uncomfortable. And so we have to briefly talk about. If we accept then that the settler-colonial state is inherently genocidal in character, despite what someone like Caleb Maupin might have you believe about the value of US patriotism and the US settler nation state. Caleb Maupin, by the way, is a man who always looks like he's in the middle of a job interview that's going really, really badly. Like someone's just asked him what he's been doing for the past few years. What's this gap in his CV? And he has to say, well, you know, spreading weird misinformation about random e-celebs, talking about Burger King. What's he supposed to say? Oh, what a bizarre man. Anyway, but are we really going to wring our hands about violent resistance? As Frantz Fanon points out,
national liberation, national renaissance, the restoration of nationhood to the people, commonwealth, whatever may be the headings used or the new formulas introduced, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. Decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder, but it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor of a natural shock, nor of a friendly understanding.
You know, the left is often quick to recognise that revolutionary politics requires a degree of violence, whether that's in like resisting state violence or appropriating the property of the capitalistic class. But as soon as it's about decolonisation, suddenly white leftists get kind of jittery. They start worrying about white genocide and violence. They start worrying about the methods of the colonised that they use to fight against their genocide? Like, what's that about? I know what it's about, but you know, what's that about? Not that it's the responsibility of the colonised to give one solitary fuck about what settlers think about their means of resisting colonialism, of fighting for their own liberation. Like, they're resisting a genocide. But again, I guess it should be reiterated that colonised peoples just don't want to wipe out white people. They don't want to wipe out all white people. This is a manufactured fear.
I just think that you're enacting some kind of petty revenge fantasy where you know that you've been the victim of racism your whole life, and it gives you, like, I don't know, some satisfaction of reciprocating
is
it?
that
even in revolutionary wars like the Haitian Revolution, where some white people, you know, the ones who wanted to keep owning people, were expelled from Haiti, white people who fought alongside the revolution, who fought with the colonised, with freed slaves, they were allowed to stay because, you know, genocide wasn't on the cards. Liberation was. The role of violence in liberation is not to commit genocide, but to overthrow systems of colonial domination and halt the destruction of indigenous life, land, and culture. It's liberatory. In fact, this hollow fear of the colonised as like these base, violent peoples is an essential part of the construction of one of the most devastating tools of violence in history. Throughout all this recent horseshit, there's been a consistent call from, unsurprisingly I think, largely people in the debate sphere to get black and indigenous people to say that they condemn any potential white ethnic cleansing. If you want to know why that's unsurprising, you should watch my video on debate bros and the debate sphere, which is shameless plug number 2. As we've already talked about, this isn't what colonised people want at all. But what's also important is that whiteness isn't an ethnicity, but a racial category, which is constructed around the domination of other racialised groups and is specifically constructed on top of settler colonialism and slavery. These hollow fears of white genocide promoted by like these debate-pilled social democratic piss artists serve to reify the idea of whiteness as just a neutral social category and not as one which continues to function as a means of domination. As Horn points out, when colonists first reached the shores of what would become the USA, they were a heterogeneous, multi-class, multi-religious, multinational group. But soon,
England, the scrappy Protestant underdog, moved toward pan-Europeanism, or whiteness, incorporating Scots and Irish and Welsh in the first instance, those with whom they had been warring for centuries, and then moved toward incorporating others who had been warring. British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Serb versus Croat, the list is long. All of a sudden, when crossing the Atlantic, in a manner that would make Madison Avenue blush, all are rebranded as whites, which subsumes many of the tensions, ethnic and class among them, in a new monetized and militarized identity politics of whiteness, based on expropriation of the indigenous and mass enslavement of the Africans.
Similarly, in Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson argues that
the myth of white solidarity arose and came to dominate American sensibility. It was, for the most part, a lie, but a terribly seductive one. By the end of the 19th century, it had already substantially displaced the past and mystified the relations of the day. It remains in place.
And while it's certainly true that previous to settler colonialism, slavery and capitalism, conceptions of racialization did exist, with the dawn of the colonial capitalist order, whiteness, white supremacy and the domination of all other racialized groups became an essential and foundational part of the global capitalist order. And with the embedding of settler colonialism and racial domination as whiteness into the material structures of global capitalism came a white settler epistemology, whereby Western knowledge and liberal norms of individualism, of Cartesian dualism and of private property came to define who had worth and who didn't, who's human and who isn't. Another shameless plug. For example, John Locke's view seems like a tame word for what is essentially justification for genocide. John Locke's view that indigenous modes of being didn't confer any property rights over the land for indigenous people justified the expropriation of that land and the extermination of those people in the name of a superior white European race, a superior white European way of life. This white settler epistemology is central to ongoing racialization and oppression. There is no separating whiteness from the settler, despite whatever ill-informed word vomit Vosh spews into your ear over the course of a live stream about, essentializing the white race or whatever the fuck he's talking about.
I mean, how can a person be an oppressor because of their race? Did all the millions of white people in South Africa, individually oppress all the black people there? It just seems weird to be retaliatory in that way.
The fact is, the idea of the white race is built on slavery, colonialism, and domination. There is no separating that.
This white racial frame was instrumental in creating the international slave trade, the colonization of large swaths of the globe, and in establishing contemporary, heteronormative, and patriarchal social relations. White supremacy is not only a rationalization for race, it is the foundational logic of the modern capitalist system and must be at the center of efforts to understand the significance of whiteness.
So if you saw my video on neoliberal feminism, so shameless plug again, shameless plug, shameless plug, shameless plug, shameless plug. So if you saw that video, you remember that I talked about how before colonialism in Europe there was the idea of women, but after colonialism there was white women and racialized women. It's a relational process, it's dialectics. I've not said dialectics for a while, just reminding people that I'm a bit Marxist as well. Dialectics, dialectics, dialectics. Every Marxist has to say the word dialectics at least 3 times a day or they come and steal your badge. Whiteness creates the category of blackness, of racialized otherness, and the only way to get rid of that, to free us of that, is not through genocide, but to abolish the category of whiteness entirely, which necessarily requires the abolition and the destruction of settler colonialism. Because whiteness, the native and blackness were all created through slavery and colonialism, it's necessary to fully abolish colonialism to abolish whiteness. To frame that abolition, of the structures which produce the category of whiteness and the many, many oppressions which stem from that as a genocidal process is to be innately on the side of whiteness and colonialism. It's to be a proponent of continued indigenous genocide. It's to be on the side of white supremacy. Despite the fears of colonial retribution from white settlers, whether they're fucking debate streaming social democrats who think they're anarchists or just your garden variety dipshit, the goals of decolonisation aren't about reversing domination, they're about shattering the structures and ideas of capitalism and colonialism which constantly reproduce oppression. Abolishing whiteness isn't genocide, but freedom. So far we've talked about how decolonisation isn't genocidal, but about resisting genocide, and how settler colonialism and domination are essential to the construction of whiteness. So now I'm going to talk about how white supremacy, despite what a lot of people might think, isn't just a phenomenon of the far right, but something which permeates the left too, and needs to be rooted out. So let's get back to the terrible tweet we started with, and really start boiling that piss. What this tweet does is it reveals an attitude which is frighteningly common among white leftists, that emancipation must be subordinate to the ideas and moral values of white people.
Wokely segregating my socialist movement wokely.
For Vosh and many, many others like him, the movement belongs to him. It belongs to white people. And anyone who challenges, who dares to challenge his idea, his notion of how the movement should exist, deserves to be driven out and mocked. One way in which this white ownership of the movement is expressed is through ring-fencing anti-colonial resistance within a moralistic Western frame, which still subordinates indigenous self-determination, a prerequisite to stopping colonial genocide, to the moralism of the settlers, and therefore inhibits true self-determination and maintains that genocide.
They have to have their own autonomy to decide what happens after being colonized by people. Well, and again, I don't think that's right? The solution.
There's a lot of genocide notches on that board. Forget how grim these videos are until I'm actually laying it out like that. I am working on the chicken run video for patrons. If you want the one JTT video that's going to be just a bright light of shining appreciation for the best piece of art ever produced, then sign up to my Patreon. Because otherwise it's just genocide from here on out, apparently. In subordinating black radicalism and decolonisation to the demands and fears of white leftists, people like Vosh are placing their own fears and legitimacy above the material demands of the colonised and the oppressed. It's literally a racial hierarchy. The attitudes of these, let's call them what they are, left-wing white supremacists, reminds me of this quote from Black Marxism.
If you were a colonist, you knew that your technology was superior to the Indians. You knew that you were civilized and they were savages. It was evident in your firearms, your clothing, your housing, your government, your religion. The Indians were supposed to be overcome with admiration and to join you in extracting riches from the country. But your superior technology had proved insufficient to extract anything. The Indians, keeping to themselves, laughed at your superior methods and lived from the land more abundantly and with less labor than you did. They even furnished you with the food that you somehow did not get around to growing enough of yourselves. To be thus condescended to by heathen savages was intolerable, and when your own people started deserting in order to live with them, it was too much. So you killed the Indians, tortured them, burned their villages, burned their cornfields. It proved your superiority.
I think there is a consistency between the attitude described by Robinson here and the attitudes of white leftists towards black and indigenous struggles. There's an idea that we have all the answers, that we have superior technology, education, morals, analysis, and that they should be deferent to our greatness.
I'm starting to wonder if you're educated enough to have this conversation.
If they don't toe our line though, If they don't conform to our parameters, then it's like being condescended to by them. So instead of listening to them about their own struggles, white leftists will drive them out and delegitimize them as liberals or revisionists or even fucking Nazis. This is a legacy of whiteness on the left. This is a legacy of white supremacy. And coming back to the tweet and focusing on what No Name is saying for a second, we can see that she's plainly and obviously correct. Just obviously correct. Why should white leftists, who are clearly still enamoured with white supremacy, be able to go to black and indigenous spaces and demand a solidarity to a movement which is not extending a jot of solidarity to them? Why should they be able to do that? As Horn points out,
the attempt to build class unity without confronting these underlying tensions often has meant coercing oppressed nationalities, blacks in the first place, to co-sign a kind of left-wing white nationalism. Black failure to do so leads to our denunciation, in today's terms as identitarian.
Demands like Vosh's here to force solidarity from black and indigenous people is exactly what Horn is talking about here. For the left-wing white supremacist, solidarity is not the necessity to support your comrade in their liberation, but the demand to subordinate them to yours. And if black people like Professor Flowers or St Andrewism have the gall to disagree, then they're denounced as wanting to genocide white people. And in doing so, like Horn argues, these left-wing white supremacists hand rhetorical attack lines to the right, like connecting decolonisation and genocide, which serve to stop people questioning the legitimacy of settler colonialism and, by extension, white supremacy. Yet still figures like Vosh and Caleb Maupin and any number of this coterie of ghouls still profess to support decolonisation and anti-imperialism. And how do they justify this? How do they square this with their obvious and repeated fears of white genocide and land back? They see it as a social justice campaign, not as a demand to return stolen land, halt the destruction of that land, and in doing so halt a genocide.
Now, if we're talking about other policy to redistribute power or address differences or stuff like that, then absolutely.
Through its reduction to a metaphor and subsumption within already existent social justice campaigns, decolonisation, the liberatory process, the material demands are defanged and made palatable to a white supremacist left. And talk about decolonising the curriculum or talking about decolonisation as a civil rights campaign rather than a material demand to return stolen land, we simultaneously subordinate decolonisation to settler frameworks and continue the assimilation process which maintains the genocide against the colonised. Left-wing white supremacists like Vosh can at all times invoke decolonisation to get some moral points, get some legitimacy, while at all times working to delegitimise true decolonisation and maintain white supremacy. We saw a very real example of this in the non-online left, when indigenous activists during Occupy Oakland called for a recognition that Oakland was already occupied territory and the goal should instead be to decolonise Oakland through land back rather than to reoccupy it. Settler participants in Occupy reacted not with solidarity with their oppressed indigenous comrades, but with suspicion. They instead began to question whether their solidarity would risk their position in settler society, where it would risk their ownership over the land. Decolonisation for these settlers, these left-wing settlers, was limited to the metaphorical sphere, and solidarity couldn't be extended to anything as materially dangerous to white supremacy and settler colonialism as land back. Solidarity is extended right to the point at which it begins to challenge settler-colonial social relations, and in the moment it does, that solidarity is renounced, and the denunciations begin. We see this so clearly with figures on the online left like Vosh, who claim to support decolonisation up to the point at which it unsettles their position in society, up to the point that it unsettles their whiteness. at which point they begin to aggressively delegitimize it while trying to subordinate the struggles of black and indigenous liberation to their white supremacist left social movement. This
wokely segregating my socialist movement, wokely,
is not solidarity with the wretched of the earth. This is an attempt to maintain white supremacy. A couple of weeks ago, I met an indigenous activist from Ecuador. She spoke about how her land, her culture, her people were at constant war against the system of global colonialism. How that system ate the souls not just of her people, but of the oppressors too. And she couldn't rely on the solidarity of white leftists in the global north, because we didn't understand what it is, what's happening. We didn't understand that her people are still being attacked every day. We still don't understand what white settler colonialism is doing. We're still pathologically connected, enamored with white supremacy. Colonialism is eating our souls too. And you know what? That's fucking tragic. That's fucking tragic. The people who need our solidarity the most, real solidarity, not solidarity with a shadow, can't even rely on us. The people who by rights should be among the most ready to give it, the most ready to fight with them, not leading them, but with them. And she can't rely on our solidarity because what? We're too scared of losing the benefits that we reap from her genocide. It's fucking tragic. And it's an embarrassment, frankly. This whole ordeal has been an embarrassment for the left. Even in our spaces on the online left, where the fucking bar is don't drive out black and indigenous creators by insinuating that they're Nazis and subjecting them to months-long harassment campaigns, do we fall over the fucking bar and smash our smug, bearded faces into the fucking dirt. And yet still demand deference and solidarity from those same creators, from those same groups. People are surprised that BreadTube or whatever is so white when this is the fucking state of it. What a fucking tragic state. I'm not saying that if you didn't previously show sufficient solidarity with the colonised that you're forever morally compromised. But how about instead of eating dirt, we take a lesson from Fiere's Pedagogy of the Oppressed or from Catherine Walsh and realise that rather than being slave to white supremacy, offering knee-jerk reactions mocking or condemning the demands of the colonised, we consider our place within global capitalism. We consider our place within settler colonialism, act with, not for the oppressed, and show our unconditional solidarity to the colonised across the globe, from Abya Yala to Palestine to West Papua. Maybe we can begin to make amends for the fucking state of the white left. Oh, Jesus Christ. There's that. We're done. Video's over. We're finished. This one, I don't know what it was, the edit has fucking killed me. So let's get through these credits. I'm always in this very sort of, not, drumpy's not the right word, kind of emotionally destroyed state at the end of videos. Anyway, credits. So first of all, thanks to all the people who did wonderful voiceovers. Leech Waifu, who you should follow on Twitter and buy her poetry. Bad Bunny, Kaelin Conrad, Bothered Boy, Harker the Storyteller, mainly Mandy and Liberal Cook, all have great channels that you should follow immediately. Do it right now. Also, thanks to my beautiful patrons for helping me get through this, for putting up with the time it takes me to do one of these videos, and for supporting me through my PhD. We're probably going to have to change some things around because there's a lot of names to read out, and it's starting to take a long time, which is a nice problem to have. But here we go for reading out the lovely patron names. First, I'm going to fuck this up, by the way. I'm going to fuck up names. I'm not going to re-record this. I'm too tired. Sorry. So, first names, Elistren, Flatulent Jiggly Kitten, Liz Castro, Ghost, Attercop, Olivia Uwehand, Capitalism Sucks, Barney Carroll, Beef Bob Jones, Izzy Wintrell, Sophie, Paul Singleton, Tamak Presbyter, Seamus Morrison, Stephanie Beverly, Sinan Kos, Nelly Zacheva, Mercutio, Daniel Hughes, Hey Joe, Luke Evans, Gary Dillon, Teo Adewale, Callum, Sankara Stan 77, Paul Bartley, Peter Basilek, Charlie Hallam, Dan Wheatley, James Fielder, Jamtapot, Jane Pickering, Alec the Lad, Battle Whisk, Finley Bewick Copley, Harry Hanford, Jens, Joel, Mackenzie Milton, Nemo, Paul Bartley, BA Do Intellectual Property Crime, Aaron Jade Red Kimmy, Rembe, Sophie Sexton, and Lila, who couldn't think of a fun name to troll me this week. Oh boy. That's that done. Yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you're all well. Love you all. Foster a parasocial relationship. Bye. Alright, let's take a look. Typical Johntheduncan video, we've got, what's the tallies? 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 33 mentions of genocide, 9 of Vosh, and 4 shameless self-promotions. Not a bad tally for a JTD video.